conditions. If you have marginal soil moisture, it works okay. If you're seeding into higher moisture soils, you need something, either a spike wheel, a Thompson wheel, something like this, that gives you what I call segmented closing. It's the same as a corn planter. Almost every corn planter in the States will run some kind of segmented wheel to help spade in the sidewalls. The smooth round wheels, again in higher moisture soils, especially the clay soils, barely close the slot. It takes a lot of force to close the slot. It takes a huge amount of force to close it. It can. And the other challenge to go along with that, if it takes a huge amount of force to close that slot, a seed is a fragile thing, as everybody knows. If it takes a huge amount of force to close that slot, you can have a big reduction in germination. Just emergence out of the ground. I guess emergence rather than germination. These are aftermarket wheels. There's different aftermarket wheels on the market. These are just a 13-inch spike wheel made out of half-inch thick material. The Thompson would be another option. They're 13 inches also. They're 5/16 in thickness. But either one will spade the sidewalls in much better than the factory ones. So we're cutting with the disc, narrow gauge wheels to regulate seeding depth, firming wheels to press the seed into the bottom of the seed slot and then close the seed slot, ideally with some kind of segmented closing wheel. This is, in my opinion, all of the elements that are required. The only weakness in this system is the physical delivery of the seed. A lot of and I'm not just picking on John Deere, all of them are pretty ordinary. Just from a point of view of seed distribution, in a meter a row or 10 meters a row, you might end up with 3 or 4 seeds and a gap and a seed and gap and 10 seeds. That's the opportunity, and that's where I think a lot of your concerns are from a point of view. When you go out to 15-inch rows, unless you can improve your distribution of seeds in the row, if you've got a gap on 15-inch rows, then you've got a big gap at harvest time with absolutely nothing within that region within the field. So it's a function of eliminating the gaps. Case, and it's 10, 12, or 15 years ago, and they did not pursue it, and maybe they will in the future. But Case had a few prototype drills floating around. I know of at least 1 or 2 that had a singulator above the opener. So you've got a cart up front that conveys seed to a singulator, and that singulator was actually dropping seed down into that row. That is probably something that I'm going to encourage manufacturers to look at. I mean, I have done, but we've not got anywhere yet. But if you could singulate seed on an air seeder right above the opener, I think you'd have something. Yeah, when you've got a confined seed slot, this would be a confined seed slot. So this is a seed slot that's about 19, 20 mil wide. If you're running an excessive amount of airspeed, and if you're putting fertilizer down, you've got to maintain a minimum amount of airspeed. It's very, very easy to blow seed out of a confined seed slot that's 30 or 40 mil deep and 19 mil wide. So yeah, absolutely. Any kind of diffuser would be positive in this environment, especially if you have to run higher fan speeds. Problem is a lot of the seeders in the States are getting out 50, 60 foot, 70 foot, 80 foot, and the amount of air fan speed or air volume it requires to blow seeds out to the ends of the seeder is huge, so you've not got an option. You have to run high fan speeds, especially with higher fertilizer rates, so then diffusers get to be even more important. But yeah, diffusers are important with single disc seeders. I'd say a lot more important than a hoe drill, yes.
You got any thoughts on boot design and position to get the seed at the bottom of the slot at all?
That's a good question. I'd have to think about that. The question there was boot design, where it would need to be. I guess just expanding your thoughts out, and I need a photograph to explain better where I'm going. Let me find one that might be better. Excuse me for this. Let me use this one for an example. I mean, obviously what we're trying to do, and I discussed the Bourgault drill earlier on, that's the one with the walking tandem, the one that has a walking tandem design. So basically what they're doing on their drill is using the closing wheel and the gauge wheel with a pivot point here, which gives you some oscillation. But ideally, you would have the boot, I'm going to say, opposite the gauge wheel to the point in which your gauge wheel, your boot, and your disc entry point would be right there close together. Now, obviously, the boot would need to angle backwards to prevent plug-in, but I'm going to suggest that the boot would need to be very close to opposite the gauge wheel, because you're trying to regulate depth. You want to maximize seating depth as well as possible. I like the Bourgault design better than the Deere design, just because it helps even out some of the undulations in the field. So if you've got any kind of track or rock or a clump of residue, it's not going to allow the disc to exit the soil, similar to what these gauge wheels would do. Now there's other softer gauge wheel materials on the market that might help absorb the impact of a rock, but they don't last very long. So then you're back to a harder material that lasts longer, but when you hit a rock, it bounces out and disengages the disc out of the ground. But the challenge that you have, obviously the larger the disc blade, depending on the angle that you turn it relative to forwards, the more you swing a disc blade out, the wider the slot, and the wider the slot, the more room it gives you to put a boot inside that slot. And the larger the seeds are, the wider the boot has to be. So if you're planting some of your larger beans, chickpeas, etc., you need a fairly wide boot to fit down into that slot created by the disc. But I would maintain the gauge wheel and the boot would need to be as close as possible relative to the disc. I would suggest that any kind of firming device will probably only press vertically downwards. I don't think many of them would capture the seed and move it to the side. And if it did move it to the side, it may move it to the wrong side. I would suggest they push downwards. The only thing I'd suggest, and it kind of goes back to what we talked about with seed firming, I'm going to suggest it's critical, whatever seeder you've got or whatever seeder you're considering, you need some kind of firming device, be it a wheel or a Keaton seed firmer of some kind, to press that seed down. I need to find the photographs. I've been sent some from the Sanford group, but like I said earlier on in the presentation, they did some work actually with the John Deere single disc seeders, with wheels, without wheels, and they were seeing big differences in emergence. I mean, they had a strike with a crop where they had firming wheels compared to where they didn't. So I see the firming wheel itself to be a very important package to press seeds into moisture before that loose soil falls in above it, assuming you've got loose soil that falls in.
So will a seed firming wheel do a better job than a Keaton?
A wheel will do a much better job than a Keaton, only for the reason that you can, on most brands, you can put 20 or 30 pounds, 10 or 15 kgs of weight on a wheel. You can't put more than 0.5, 0.6, 0.7 kilos on a Keaton. So you really don't get much weight on a Keaton. A Keaton really works better in higher moisture soils when you really don't need them, because you press the seed into the soil easier. So a wheel would be, in my opinion, a must on whatever brand or type of drill that you've got.
Just changing directions a little bit. You're obviously all on disc, but going on what you're saying on time, therefore there's a lot of bars running around with fresh wheels running right across the back. You'd favour one that runs right behind the time.
Yeah, I would say it's a gradual progression. Just switching gears to a hoe drill, for example, I would say a firming wheel behind a hoe drill narrow point, assuming it's a real narrow point, would be a lot better than one at the back, and especially better than one that's rigidly 10, 20, 15, whatever that number is, mounted rigidly on a bar. So yes, any kind of firming wheel would be positive.